Now, it's only fair that I give you a warning. This podcast talks about serial killers, murderers, cults, child molesters, war criminals, and more. Heinous criminals who occupy the darkest corners of the human mind. It is not for the faint of heart. Listener discretion is advised. You have been warned. Wichita in Kansas is not a city that expects to carry a national scar. It sits low and flat on the southern plains. It's built on aircraft manufacturing, grain, churches, and neighborhoods where routines repeat with Midwestern regularity. In the 1970s, Wichita sold itself as orderly and predictable, a place where violence was an interruption, not a constant. When murder did occur, it was usually personal, explainable, and quickly resolved. That assumption would be tested and then broken by a man who wanted not only to kill, but to be known. Between 1974 and 1991, a serial murderer operated in Wichita and its surrounding communities, binding, torturing, and killing at least 10 people, men, women, and children inside their own homes. Although he occasionally attacked males and children, he typically targeted women. His victims were often attacked in their residences, restrained with rope, cord, belts, or whatever objects the house itself could provide, and killed by suffocation with plastic bags or ligature strangulation. He did not simply leave bodies behind. He left messages, letters, poems, threats, and diagrams. He demanded attention, mocked police, and instructed newspapers on how to communicate with him. He even named himself BTK, bind, torture, kill. The name was not imposed by the press or law enforcement. It was chosen deliberately by the killer himself, a form of branding that reduced human lives to a 3-word process. He wanted the city to understand how he worked, and he wanted credit for every step. For decades, BTK existed as a ghost story with a paper trail. He struck, then vanished. Years would pass. Police officers would retire, detectives passed away, the files yellowed, and then, without warning, he would resurface, sending a letter, a package, a reminder that he was still alive, still watching, and still unpunished. The man behind BTK was not a drifter. He was not visibly unstable. He did not live on the margins of society. He was a husband, a father of 2, a Cub Scout leader, a church council president, and a compliance officer for Park City, Kansas. For years, he also moved through Wichita in a uniformed, legitimate role that placed him inside homes for a living. From 1974 to 1988, he worked for ADT Security Services, installing alarms for families trying to protect themselves from the kind of intrusion he perfected. His name was Dennis Lynn Rader. The central question of this documentary is not simply how Dennis Rader killed, or even why. It is how he managed to exist in plain sight for more than 30 years, how systems failed to identify him, how communities misread him, and how his own need for recognition ultimately became the instrument of his capture. To understand BTK, it is necessary to begin not with his first murder, but within the environment that allowed him to believe he could operate indefinitely. In January 1974, Wichita was already uneasy. The city had experienced a recent rise in violent crime, including several unsolved murders that had unsettled residents and taxed local law enforcement. For Wichita, violent crime was the exception, not the rule. The police department was capable, but not specialized. The idea of a long-term serial offender, one who would stalk families, kill multiple victims in a single event, and then disappear for years, was not yet part of the department's operational imagination. The term serial killer itself was not in widespread use. Behavioral profiling was in its infancy. The FBI's behavioral science unit existed, but its methods were still experimental and often viewed skeptically by local departments. Homicide investigations were largely reactive, built around witnesses, physical evidence, and confessions. When those were absent, cases would stall. Dennis Rader understood this landscape intuitively, even if he could not have articulated it formally. He understood response times, he understood jurisdictional fragmentation, he understood that a city accustomed to safety would look first for explanations that preserved its sense of normalcy. His crimes would exploit those assumptions. Dennis Lynn Rader entered the world on March 9, 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas. He was the first of 4 sons born to William and Dorothea Rader. His father had served in the Marine Corps and later worked for a gas company. His mother kept the books for a local business. Both parents held steady jobs, valued routine, and anchored family in conservative Lutheran faith. They had their first child at the tail end of the Second World War, in a country that was optimistic, busy, and already shifting towards suburban life. In those early years, the Raiders did not stay in Pittsburgh. The family moved to Wichita, a growing city that revolved around aviation plants, oil, and the rail lines cutting across the plains. The move placed Dennis in a typical Midwestern childhood setting: modest houses, schoolyards, church basements, and open fields at the edge of town. He attended Riverview Elementary School and blended into a sea of boys in crew cuts and plain shirts. Teachers and classmates remembered him as quiet, withdrawn, not especially remarkable academically, but not disruptive either. He joined the Cub Scouts and spent time fishing, reading comics, and roaming his neighborhood, like many boys of his age. At home, his parents' long work hours meant that much of the day-to-day life of the children unfolded with limited adult attention. Rader later described feeling overlooked, pushed aside by obligations and fatigue. His father in particular came home tired and stern. Discipline in the house was strict, but not extraordinary for the time. Expectations were clear, affection less so. The family's involvement in Zion Lutheran Church gave the boys a steady religious framework and regular Sunday routines, services, catechism, and church events that emphasized obedience, sin, and redemption. Beneath that ordinary surface, Rader's interior life started to drift in a different direction. While still in grade school, he began to experience sexual fantasies that centered on domination, bondage, and the control of women. These thoughts were not fleeting curiosities. They solidified into recurring private scenarios that he revisited alone, imagining women bound, helpless, and unable to resist him. He fixated on the physical details of tying and restraining them, and on the idea that their fear and immobility were central to his arousal. That inner world soon translated into behavior. As a boy, he started experimenting with cruelty to animals. He tortured and killed small creatures, cats, dogs, other available animals, and sometimes staged their bodies, hanging them in ways that mirrored the bondage themes forming in his mind. Zoo sadism, as psychologists later described it, became an early outlet for the combination of curiosity, anger, and sexual charge he connected to control and suffering. In the backyard or in isolated spots near his home, he rehearsed his fantasies on living targets that could not speak and could not tell anyone what he was doing. As he moved into adolescence, the gap between his outer and inner lives widened. In school, he remained an average student, socially awkward, introverted, and more comfortable on the sidelines than in the middle of teenage circles. He did not develop the kind of visible delinquent pattern of fights, arrests, dramatic outbursts that might have drawn serious attention. Instead, he carried a growing set of sexual fetishes that he kept hidden: voyeurism, autoerotic, asphyxiation, even cross-dressing. He stole women's underwear, sometimes from neighbors' clotheslines, sometimes from homes where he had access. He would put the clothing on in private, bind himself, and stage scenarios in which he imagined himself both victim and offender, tired and helpless, but also in full control of the scene he had created. These rituals were not occasional experiments. They became regular, structured activities in his life. He developed what he later called projects, detailed fantasy narratives involving specific women, real or imagined, whom he pictured bound and terrorized. In some of these internal stories, he transformed himself into a figure he labeled Factor X, an almost separate persona that he blamed for his darkest urges. The term allowed him to split his sense of self, the outer boy and the young man who followed rules and sought approval, and an inner agent of cruelty who existed only in secret. By the mid-1960s, as the country entered a period of social upheaval, Rader's path took a more conventional turn. In June 1966, at age 21, he enlisted in the United States Air Force. The move carried him out of Kansas for the first sustained period of his life. He went through basic training and technical schooling in Texas, then received assignments that took him to Alabama, Turkey, Greece, South Korea, Japan, and back again. He worked as an antenna installer and maintenance specialist, a job that required technical competence, routine, and the ability to follow orders without question. In the Air Force, he learned how to live inside a strict chain of command. He advanced to the rank of Staff Sergeant, collected a Good Conduct Medal, a Marksmanship Ribbon, and the Standard National Defense Service Medal awarded in that era. A military environment suited parts of his temperament. He liked rules, hierarchies, and clear expectations. He adapted smoothly, caused no major trouble, and left a record that looked respectable. The structure may have reinforced his belief that as long as he met external standards, punctuality, discipline, and reliability, his private life was his own sealed territory. His sexual preoccupations did not disappear during service. Away from home, with access to new environments and more anonymity, he continued to feed his fantasies. He sought out pornography and stories that emphasized bondage and domination. He later credited his time in the Air Force with exposing him to more explicit sexual material and language, at a stage when his peers back in Kansas were still rooted in a more conservative culture. The contrast between the disciplined, uniformed airman and the private consumer of extreme fantasies sharpened the split he had already built inside himself. On August 12, 1970, he received an honorable discharge and returned to Wichita. He was 25 years old, trained, and worldly by the standards of his hometown, and equipped with a mix of technical skills and rigid habits formed in the military. Back in Kansas, he tried to step into the standard sequence of adult milestones: work, education, marriage, and family. He briefly attended Kansas Wesleyan University in Salina, but he did not complete a degree there. Later, he would enroll at Butler County Community College and earn an associate degree in electronics, and eventually a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Wichita State University, taking classes part-time whilst he was working. That last choice, studying criminal justice, sat beside his emerging criminal fantasies in a way that he alone fully understood. In 1971, he married Paula Dietz, a young woman from the Wichita area who attended the same Lutheran church. Paula came from a stable religious family and worked as a bookkeeper, mirroring the kind of steady, modest life Rader had always known. Their wedding and early married life looked unremarkable, church-centered, budget-conscious, and focused on building a small, respectable household. From the outside, their relationship matched local expectations. They rented an apartment, juggled work and home tasks, and made plans for the future. At the same time, Rader's inner world did not soften with marriage. He continued to cultivate his fantasies in secret. When he had privacy, he still staged his own bondage scenes, photographed himself in stolen women's clothing and masks, and refined what he called his hit kits, collections of items like rope, tape, and tools that he imagined using in real attacks. He took note of women around him, not just as neighbours or fellow churchgoers, but as potential projects. He watched their routines, the times they left for work, the layout of their houses. He filed this information away, not yet ready to act on it, but not willing to let it go either. Around him, Wichita was changing. The early 1970s brought economic shifts, cultural change, and a slow erosion of the insular feel that had defined mid-century life. For Rader, the city provided something he had not fully had as a child: anonymity in a larger grid of streets and neighborhoods. He drove through residential areas, noticed details that others ignored: curtains left open at night, side doors without deadbolts, basement windows that looked easy to pry open. His mind turned these observations into possibilities. He began to imagine not just fantasy scenes, but actual intrusions, entering homes, binding occupants, and exerting the control he had rehearsed internally for years. By 1973, he had taken a job as an installer for ADT Security Services in the Wichita area. The role gave him direct access to people's homes and businesses at a time when concern about burglary and crime was rising. He walked through the hallways, examined the windows, studied doors and yards, and learned precisely how families tried to protect themselves. Ironically, he helped install the very system some residents requested because they feared a prowler or intruder. He learned where homeowners hid spare keys, how they scheduled service visits, and how easily trust was extended to a man in uniform carrying tools and paperwork. His personal life continued to look solid. In 1974, he and Paula welcomed their first child, a son. Later, they would have a daughter. They bought a modest home in the northeast of Wichita in the suburb of Park City. Here the streets were quiet and neighbors knew each other's names. Rader became increasingly active in his church, Christ Lutheran, eventually serving as president of the church council. He led Cub Scout activities, enforced local ordinances as a compliance officer for Park City in the years to come, and built a reputation as a man who valued order and rules. Inside that ordered life, his fantasies matured into something else. He began constructing what he saw as a kind of personal mythology, a private narrative in which he was both planner and executioner, a figure who would one day be recognized for his crimes. He studied other killers in news reports and crime literature, measuring their methods against scenarios in his head. He took notes on potential victims, sketched out what he called scenarios or projects, and refined his hit kits. The distance between thought and action was getting narrower. By the early 1970s, the pattern was set. On the surface, Dennis Rader was a young husband, Air Force veteran, security installer, and church-going Kansan raising a family in a growing suburb. Beneath that, a different structure had taken shape, a life organized around fantasies of stalking, binding, and killing, supported by years of private rehearsal and careful observation. The man who had signed letters BTK had not yet committed his first known murder, but the elements that would define his crimes, control, planning, and the fusion of sexual gratification with violence, were already fully present, waiting for a moment when he would decide to cross the line from idea to act. By the start of 1974, Dennis Rader had moved from private rehearsal to active planning. He thought of his future victims as projects, each with a code name and a sequence of steps. He preferred women in their own homes, places where he could control the environment, bind them using rope or improvised ligatures, and kill by strangulation or suffocation. He took items from the scenes, underwear, jewelry, and identification, as trophies that extended the life of each crime in his imagination. The first known project was a family. On January 15, 1974, Rader approached a house on North Edgemoor in Wichita, home to Joseph and Julie Otero and several of their children. The family had only recently moved to the city. That morning, the older kids left for school. The parents remained at home with 9-year-old Joseph Jr. and 11-year-old Josephine. Rader had already watched Julie's routine and decided that this house would be his opening move. He parked away from the address, walked into the neighborhood, climbed the backyard fence and cut the telephone line. In the house, Joey opened the back door to let the dog out and walked directly into Rader in the yard. Rader pulled a .22 pistol and forced the boy back inside at gunpoint. The family initially reacted as if it might be a joke or a mistaken intrusion. Rader shut that down by telling them that he was armed, that the gun was loaded with hollow point rounds, and that he was there for money and a car. He ordered the 4 of them to lie on the living room floor, then marched them into a bedroom and began binding them with rope he had bought. Joseph and Joey were placed on the floor, Julie and Josephine on the bed. Once he had them restrained, the pretense of robbery fell away. When Joseph complained that a previous car accident had left him with a cracked rib, Rader slid a pillow underneath him. As circulation problems and discomfort mounted, he decided he would not leave anyone alive. He wrapped a plastic bag over Joseph's head and cinched it in place with a cord. When Joseph managed to chew through the plastic bag and gasp for air, Rader replaced the bag and tightened it again until the man stopped moving. He then strangled Julie with a rope. At one point during the assault, she regained consciousness and begged for the children's lives. Her appeals made no difference. He killed her on the bed, right beside her daughter. Joey watched from the same room as Rader drew a bag over his head, then added layers, shirts, another bag, until the boy's struggles slowed and ceased. Only Josephine remained alive. Rader took the 11-year-old girl down to the basement, away from the bodies upstairs. He partially undressed her, tied a noose around a pipe, and hung her, staying to watch her die. Detectives would find her with her bra torn and her panties around her ankles. He used the scene for sexual gratification before leaving the house. He drove away in the Otero family car, abandoned it in a grocery store parking lot, and walked back towards his own vehicle. Realizing he had dropped a knife in the yard, he returned to the house, recovered it, and left the scene a second time. Later that day, the Otero's older children came home from school. They found the dog outside, the kitchen in disarray, and then, in the back bedroom, their parents' bodies. Police arrived and discovered Joey and Josephine elsewhere in the house, the boy in another room, and the girl hanging in the basement. Within months, Rader moved on to the second project. He had noticed 21-year-old Catherine Bright at her small home near Wichita State University and labeled her Project Lights Out. On April 4, 1974, he approached the house while no one was inside. He broke the rear sliding glass door, stepped in, and began sweeping glass from the floor to make the break-in less obvious. His pistol discharged accidentally as he worked, filling the house with a smell of burned powder. He worried that the odor might alert his target when she returned. When Catherine came home, she was not alone. Her 19-year-old brother Kevin walked in with her. Rader met them inside with the pistol and again adopted the story that he was a fugitive from California who needed money and a car. He herded them into a bedroom and made Kevin tie his sister's hands. Next, he bound Kevin himself, using items he found in the house, bandanas and other cords, deliberately choosing different materials than he had used at the Otero scene. He separated the siblings, leaving Kevin tied to a bedpost in one room and Catherine secured in another. To mask sounds, he turned up the stereo in the living room. His plan was to strangle Kevin first. When he returned to the young man's room and began to tighten a ligature, Kevin fought back. The bindings had loosened enough for him to struggle free. Rader drew his pistol. In the close quarters fight that followed, he shot Kevin in the head, and then again as the younger man kept resisting. Kevin finally went still, and Rader left him where he lay, assuming he would die. In Catherine's room, she had heard the gunshots. When Rader came in, she demanded to know what he had done to her brother. He told her that Kevin had been shot. She fought him, hard enough that he could not maintain a choke as he had planned. He switched to a knife and stabbed her repeatedly under the ribcage as she continued to resist. When he believed she was dying, he grabbed her keys and ran outside, trying to start her vehicle. It would not turn over, so he abandoned the effort, fled on foot, and ultimately reached his own car parked on the campus. Inside the house, Kevin was still alive. He staggered out, bloody and disorientated, and reached neighbors who brought him to a hospital and alerted the police. Catherine was found gravely wounded, clutching a telephone, unable to speak clearly. Despite emergency surgery, she died from the combined effects of strangulation and multiple stab wounds. Kevin survived and later provided a description of the attacker that would feed the first composite sketch of the man who would come to be known as BTK. For the next 3 years, the known record of killings stands quiet. In that gap, Rader built the persona he would use to communicate with the city. In October 1974, he sent a letter to Wichita newspaper claiming responsibility for the Otero murders, insisting he had acted alone and signing the name BTK, explaining that the initials stood for bind, torture, kill. His next confirmed homicide took place on March 17, 1977. The victim was 24-year-old Shirley Ruth Vian, also known as Shirley Vian Relford, a mother living in a small house with her 3 children. That day, Rader initially set out with another woman in mind. When he broke into that woman's home, she was not there. Frustrated, he left and prowled the neighborhood for a substitute. On a nearby street, he encountered Shirley's 6-year-old son walking alone. Rader introduced himself as a detective and showed the boy a photograph of his own wife and daughter, asking if the child recognized them. The boy thought the image might be his mother and sister and led Rader back to the house. At the door, Rader continued the ruse, asking Shirley to look at the photograph. Once she opened up fully, he produced a gun, pushed her inside, and announced that he was a wanted man who needed money and would be robbing them. Inside, he tried to control the children, but they were too active and frightened to bind easily. So he forced Shirley to help herd them into the bathroom, where he barricaded the door with furniture. He gave them toys and other objects through the opening, warning that he would shoot them if they tried to break out. Later, he said that he intended to return to the bathroom and kill them after he finished with their mother. He took Shirley into a back bedroom. She was sick with fear and at one point vomited. He allowed her to get water, then tied her legs to the bedpost, secured her hands and pulled a plastic bag over her head. He used rope to cinch the bag tight at the neck. He strangled her as she lay bound to the bed, the bag trapping each breath until she stopped moving. At some point during or immediately after the murder, the phone rang. One of the children in the bathroom shouted that someone would be coming over. The prospect of a visitor arriving at the house forced Rader to abandon his plan and return to the bathroom. He left quickly, leaving 3 children alive in a locked, barricaded room with their mother dead in the next one. The children eventually freed themselves and reached help. Responding officers found Shirley strangled, the bathroom evidence showing how close the children had come to being killed as well. By the end of that same year, he had selected another target, 25-year-old Nancy Fox, a single woman who worked 2 jobs and lived alone in a duplex on South Pershing. He stalked her for some time, noting her schedule and the layout of her home, and filed her mentally as Project Foxhunt. On the evening of December 8, 1977, he approached her duplex after dark. He cut the phone line, pried open a rear window, and slipped inside. Nancy was not home. He waited, moving through the rooms, rehearsing what he would say and where he would position himself when she arrived. After a period of silence, he heard her keys at the door. When she saw him in the house, she shouted at him to leave and threatened to call the police. He told her that the phone would not work, then explained that he planned to tie her up, take explicit photographs, and rape her. She understood the danger but had no way out. He allowed her to smoke a cigarette as a final pause before the assault. He cut off access to the outside world and guided each step. He let Nancy go to the bathroom after she promised not to attempt an escape. When she came out, he told her to remove part of her clothing. He undressed down to his undershirt and prepared restraints. When he tried to remove the rest of her clothing, she resisted, pushing back against his attempts to strip her. He produced handcuffs. She protested, asking why they were necessary. He insisted that they were part of how he did things and cuffed her wrists. With her partially undressed and restrained, he pushed her onto the bed and climbed over her, looping a belt around her neck. He tightened and loosened it repeatedly, bringing her close to unconsciousness and then back again, prolonging her fear and his own gratification. In the end, he kept the belt tight until she stopped moving. He rearranged the scene, took items he wanted to keep, and left her dead in the duplex. The next day, he made one of the most brazen moves of his series. From a payphone, he called the police emergency line and calmly reported that they would find a homicide at Nancy Fox's address. He gave her name and street. The call was recorded and later released publicly, but no one who heard it could identify the voice as anyone they knew. Now, not every planned project ended in a killing. In 1979, Rader targeted 63-year-old Anna Williams and broke into her home. He waited for hours in the dark, expecting her at a particular time. She stayed out later with friends, returning much later than he anticipated. Eventually, he lost patience, left without confronting her, and stole some personal items. Weeks later, she received a letter in which BTK expressed anger that she had not appeared, accompanied by a drawing of a bound woman and items taken from her house. The near miss rattled her and underlined how much his crimes depend on the routines of everyday life. After Nancy Fox, there was another pause in confirmed murders. Behind the scenes, Rader continued his private rituals and lower-level offences. In April of 1985, he set up another project that would bring his violence uncomfortably close to his own front door. 53-year-old Maureen Hedge lived only a few houses away from the Rader family in Park City. Neighbours knew her as a quiet woman who kept to herself. Rader named her Project Cookie and decided to test whether he could kill a neighbour and still maintain his standing as a reliable husband, father, and church leader. On the weekend of April the 27th, he attended a Boy Scout camping trip as a leader. That night he claimed a headache from the wet, cold weather and left, saying he needed to go home. Instead, he drove to a secluded spot, changed out of his scout uniform into dark clothing, and continued to a bowling alley across town. There, he ordered a beer, splashed some on his clothes and face, and used a slurred voice to call a taxi, creating an impression of a man out drinking rather than a man stalking a neighbour. The cab dropped him on a street near his house and near hedges. He walked the rest of the way, cut the phone line into her home, and slipped inside to hide in a bedroom closet. Hedge came home later with a boyfriend. Rader stayed hidden while they talked and moved around the house. Eventually, the boyfriend left the house. When Rader had judged that Hedge was asleep, he stepped from the closet and quickly flipped the bathroom light on to startle her awake. She screamed. He moved quickly, subduing her and getting handcuffs onto her wrists. Once he had her under control, he strangled her. With the house now silent, he stood inside the home of a woman his family greeted on the street and prepared for the second stage of his plan. The next year brought another victim, 28-year-old Vicki Lynn Rader. She lived in Wichita with her husband and a young child and played the piano in their home. Rader noticed her while on his rounds for ADT, seeing her getting into her car and later hearing piano music when he prowled near the house. He labelled her Project Piano. On September 6, 1986, he arrived in her neighbourhood wearing an ADT hard hat and carrying a Southwestern Bell telephone manual, adopting the role of a phone repair technician. He first visited a neighbour's house and did a brief, harmless check of their line to build credibility. Then he knocked on the girl's door, explained that he needed to inspect her telephone terminals, and was invited inside. She led him to a phone near the dining table. He chatted casually while pretending to test the line. After declaring that everything looked fine, he drew a gun and told her they would be going to the bedroom. She warned him that her husband would be home soon. He pushed ahead anyway. In the bedroom, he tried to bind her. She fought him, hard enough to scratch his face deeply. Decades later, he still referred to the mark. The struggle upset the family dogs and sent them into a barking fit. With windows open and the possibility of the husband returning, Rader knew he had limited time. He proceeded to strangle her. Accounts point to a ligature around the neck and left her on the floor. Even under pressure, he followed his pattern. He took photographs of her body for sexual purposes, as he later described it, and removed her driver's license as a trophy. He drove away in her car and by chance passed her husband heading home. A short distance away, he parked the car at a grocery store, walked back to his own vehicle, and drove past the house once more. This time he saw emergency vehicles outside as paramedics tried to save her. The girl died at the hospital. For years her homicide was not definitively linked to BTK. That connection would come only when Rader mailed copies of the stolen license and crime scene photos nearly 2 decades later. The last known murder took place in January 1991 in a small rural area not far from Park City. 62-year-old Dolores Davis was retired and living alone in a house near dog kennels and a highway. Rader called her Project Dogside. He observed her house repeatedly, working out how he might get inside without drawing attention. On January 18th, he was again with the Scouts at their annual winter campout in Harvey County Park West. Once more he used the cover of a headache and the need to go home to leave the group. He drove to his parents' house, changed clothes, and then went to Park City Baptist Church, where he parked and set out on foot. He crossed wheat fields and moved through a cemetery to approach Davis's home from a less obvious direction. The night was bitterly cold. Instead of attempting a quieter entry, he picked up a cinder block and smashed it through the sliding glass door. The crash brought Davis from her room. She confronted him in her own house. He claimed that he was on the run, that he needed to tie her up, take her car and some food, and then he would leave. She refused. He then told her he had a gun, a club, and a knife. Facing multiple weapons, she stopped resisting. He secured the keys to her car and ransacked the kitchen, making a show of looking for food while he kept control of the scene. Davis begged for her life. He took a pair of pantyhose, looped them around her neck, and strangled her. As with previous victims, he had intended to stay, pose the body, and take photographs. But she said that someone would be coming by soon. Whether he believed her or not, the claim made him cut the session short. He wrapped her body in a bedspread, dragged it out to the car and loaded it into the trunk. He drove to an isolated lake adjacent to the property used by the State Transportation Department and left her among the brush. He then returned the car to her house, climbed onto the roof and tossed her keys there, a detail he copied from accounts of police searching the Otero house roof years before. After that, he walked back across the fields to the church, got into his own car and drove back to the scout camp to resume his role as an adult leader. Later, he moved Davis' body again, taking her from the initial dump site to a more remote area under a bridge. On February 1st, 1991, a 15-year-old boy walking his dog along that bridge followed the animal down the embankment and found her remains. For the families of Wichita and the surrounding communities, the discovery marked the end of the known series. For more than a decade afterward, there were no further confirmed BTK murders. Across those 17 years of killing, Rader developed and repeated a set of methods, adapting them when victims resisted or circumstances changed, but always returning to the same core pattern: stalking, forced entry or deception, binding, and slow deliberate strangulation. Each scene ended with a dead or dying victim and a man walking back into the ordinary roles of father, employee, and church member, carrying with him photographs, stolen objects, and the memory of what he had done. When officers walked through the Otero house in January 1974, they faced a scene with more questions than answers. 4 members of a single family were dead, bound with varying knots, with no clear sign of forced entry on the main doors and no obvious suspect. Detectives catalogued the ligatures, the positions of the bodies, and the cut telephone line. They canvassed the neighbourhood, gathered tips, and chased leads that ranged from personal grudges to a supposed hit connected to Joseph Otero's work. At one point, they even considered whether the murders might be linked to organised crime. None of those avenues produced a coherent suspect. The pressure to solve the case was intense. Wichita had seen homicides before, but nothing with this level of brutality, especially including 2 children. In the months that followed, detectives fielded confessions from disturbed individuals seeking attention, none of which matched the physical details of the crime. The investigation lurched forward and stalled, a pattern that would recur for decades as the man responsible watched from a distance. The first real shift came in October 1974, 9 months after the Otero murders. A letter arrived at the offices of a Wichita newspaper. It claimed responsibility for the Otero killings, described the scene in ways that matched what officers had found, and insisted that police were wasting time on the wrong suspects. The author gave himself a name built from his favoured ritual. BTK, bind, torture, kill. The message was both a confession and a demand for recognition. The letter forced investigators to confront the likelihood that they were dealing with a single offender whose motive reached beyond robbery or personal revenge. The specificity of the details linked the unknown writer directly to the crime scene. Detectives formed a small group to focus on the new lead, but BTK remained a phantom. The composite sketches based on surviving victim Kevin Bright's description failed to generate any strong suspects. The killing of Catherine Bright, followed by the later homicides of Shirley Vian and Nancy Fox, expanded the pattern without bringing detectives closer to a name. With each new crime scene, investigators recognized familiar elements: bindings with knots that showed planning, ligatures tightened around necks, telephone lines cut. They photographed everything and stored physical evidence in the hope that some future technique might wring out more information from it. At the time, blood typing and latent prints were the most they could reliably use. BTK did not leave usable fingerprints. He wore gloves, wiped surfaces, and limited his contact with objects he did not plan to remove from the scene. Communication from the killer continued intermittently. In 1978, he sent a letter to a local television station, writing in a stiff, artificial style and referencing other high-profile killers. He complained about the lack of attention and asked, "How many people do I have to kill before I get a name in the paper or some national attention?" He enclosed a poem about Nancy Fox and suggested nicknames for himself, including the one that stuck. Police had to decide how much of these communications to release. On one hand, the letters might draw out useful tips. On the other, amplifying BTK's words risked feeding his need for notoriety. Behind closed doors, detectives and administrators debated strategy. They studied the language and spelling, looked for unique phrasing, and consulted with behavioral experts to build a profile. The picture that emerged described a white male, likely local, organized and intelligent, with a need for control and a streak for grievance. It was accurate in broad strokes, but still too generic to pick one man out of thousands. By the early 1980s, the case burden had grown heavy. Detectives had stacks of files labeling each victim as part of a single series, plus volumes of tips, false leads, and reports of suspicious men spotted near crime scenes. The department formed a formal BTK task force, cycling in fresh investigators as older ones retired or shifted to other cases. The team tracked known sex offenders, evaluated men reported by ex-wives or girlfriends as controlling or violent, and revisited earlier interviews for missed details. None of those efforts produced a suspect whose movements matched all of the murders. Meanwhile, forensic science was changing. Biological samples from several scenes, including semen and skin under victims' fingernails, had been preserved in sealed containers. As DNA profiling emerged in the mid-1980s and matured in the 90s, the evidence was revisited. Analysis developed genetic profiles from BTK-related samples and entered them into national databases. No match appeared. The profile could exclude suspects, but there was no reference sample to link to the killer. The 1986 killing of Vicky Wagirl complicated the picture further. Unlike earlier scenes, that homicide did not immediately fit the established pattern in the eyes of everyone involved. She had been strangled in her home during the day. Some features were similar: ligature marks, a husband away from the house at the critical moment, but the former connection to BTK was not made at the time. Her case remained open as a separate homicide, while the BTK task force continued to review old leads and examine new ones. After Dolores Davis was found in 1991, the series effectively stopped. Forensic work continued in spurts, but the murders ceased. Families clung to the hope that the killer had died, left the area, or been imprisoned on another charge. For investigators, the absence of fresh crime scenes undercut one of their most basic tools: comparison. New offences often bring with them new witnesses and fresh traces of the offender. In this case, nothing. Years turned into more than a decade of silence. By the early 2000s, BTK was considered a cold case. The files remained accessible, and anniversaries of the Otero murders or other landmarks occasionally prompted media coverage, but no one expected contact from the killer himself. Then, in January 2004, the 13th anniversary of the Otero murders approached. A Wichita newspaper ran a story looking back at the crime and reflecting on the long, unsolved trail of killings that followed. The article suggested that BTK might be dead or in prison. The man who had named himself BTK read that story. It stirred the same mix of pride and resentment that had driven him to write in the 1970s. In March 2004, an envelope arrived at the newspaper. Inside were photocopies and photographs taken of Vicky Wagel's body and a copy of her driver's license stolen from the crime scene 18 years earlier. The writer identified himself again as BTK and implicitly claimed Wagel as a victim in his series. For investigators, the letter did two things at once. It confirmed that BTK was alive and tied the Wagel case firmly to the earlier murders. The Wichita Police Department reactivated the BTK task force at full strength. Detectives who had long since left the case returned as consultants. Younger officers, some of whom had grown up in Wichita during the original panic, joined the effort. The new task force combined old-fashioned shoe leather work with modern forensic tools. They revisited the preserved DNA evidence with updated techniques, reanalyzed the language of BTK's letters using computer-assisted methods, and mapped the locations and dates of each communication and crime. BTK escalated his contact. Over the next year, he sent multiple packages and letters to local media and occasionally directly to the police. Some arrived in the mail, others were left in public places, such as a cereal box dropped into the bed of a pickup truck in a hardware store parking lot, and another placed by a road sign. Inside, investigators found dolls bound and gagged to mimic his victims, photocopies of photographs from crime scenes, and long, rambling texts in which he suggested titles for a book about himself and played games with officers trying to catch him. Amid that flurry of contact came a crucial exchange. In one message, BTK asked police whether computer disks could be traced. If he were to send a floppy disk, he wanted to know would they be able to identify him from it. He asked for a simple yes or no. Investigators faced a tactical decision: tell him the truth and risk losing a valuable chance, or lie to keep him engaged. They decided to answer in a way that would encourage him to send digital media. Through a newspaper ad and broadcast statements crafted to reach him, they assured him that the disk would be safe. In January 2005, a small package arrived at a television station in Wichita. Inside was a purple 1.44 megabyte floppy disk, a letter, and a piece of jewelry. The letter referred again to BTK and mentioned earlier communications. The station turned the materials over to the police, who immediately isolated the disk and handed it to digital forensic specialists. Using forensic software, they examined the contents and recovered the data that BTK believed he had deleted. In the metadata of a Microsoft Word document, they found two key pieces of information. The file had last been saved by a user named Dennis on a computer at Christ Lutheran Church. That was the first clear, objective trail connecting BTK to a specific place and first name. Investigators compiled a list of men named Dennis associated with that church. The list was short. One name on it stood out: Lynn Rader, a middle-aged man who served as president of the church council and worked as a compliance officer for the nearby suburb of Park City. Detectives began a quiet background check. His age fit, his residence in Park City placed him near several crime scenes, and his work installing security systems in the 1970s and later enforcing local ordinances had given him access to homes and neighborhoods over decades. Rather than move immediately to arrest, investigators chose to build a case layer by layer. They placed Rader under surveillance, documenting his routines, vehicles, and contacts. They checked his past employment with a security company and his college coursework in criminal justice. They noted his role in the church, identified by the disc. None of this alone proved he was BTK, but the converging details narrowed the field sharply. The DNA profile remained the gold standard for confirmation. Detectives did not yet have Rader's DNA, and they were wary of approaching him directly for a sample. A request might alert him and push him back into silence or prompt him to destroy evidence. They looked instead at family members. His adult daughter Kerry had lived in Kansas and received medical care there. Investigators obtained a court order for access to her medical records, and through those records secured a preserved sample from a routine gynecological test. From that material, forensic analysis developed her DNA profile. Comparing the daughter's profile to the DNA from BTK crime scenes provided what they needed. The genetic relationship between the two samples indicated that the unknown killer and Kerry's father were the same person. With that match in hand, detectives and prosecutors secured arrest and search warrants. The decision of when and how to take him into custody became the next critical step. On February the 25th, 2005, shortly after noon, officers followed Rader as he drove a black Jeep Cherokee near his home in Park City. A convoy of unmarked and marked vehicles moved in, boxing him in on a quiet street. An officer approached, asked him to step out, and placed him under arrest. When asked if he knew why he was being taken downtown, Rader replied that he had his suspicions. The man who had spent decades writing taunts as BTK did not protest loudly or attempt to run. Simultaneously, teams executed search warrants on his home, his office at City Hall, Christ Lutheran Church, and his vehicles. Inside the modest Park City house, investigators found what they had long suspected existed: a private archive. Hidden in false ceilings, behind wall panels, and in concealed compartments were boxes and containers holding photographs of crime scenes and victims, sketches of bound women, meticulously typed stories about his projects, and trophies taken from murders, jewelry, clothing, and other personal items. Computer equipment, discs, and printed BTK communications added an electronic layer to the physical cache. At the church office and local library branches he frequented, investigators seized more computer hardware and documents. The pattern across locations reinforced the conclusion that the same man who carried church meetings and wrote neighborhood code citations had maintained a secret record of his crime for years. The search teams worked methodically, wearing gloves, labeling every item, and sending key pieces for forensic analysis. Back at police headquarters, detectives began the first round of formal interviews. Early exchanges focused on basic background information and his movements over the year. Rader initially played cautious, asking about whether Kansas had the death penalty and what kind of sentence someone in his position might face. Kansas had reinstated capital punishment in 1994, but the law did not cover crimes committed before that date, a limitation that would shape what prosecutors could seek. As the evidence collected from his home and the DNA match were laid out, his posture shifted. Within days he began acknowledging his role. He referred to his killings as projects and used the BTK name in the third person, as if discussing a separate entity. The interrogation sessions grew longer and more detailed. Detectives who had spent parts of their careers chasing BTK now sat across the table from the man himself as he walked them through crime after crime, calmly explaining how he had watched houses, assembled his kits, and carried out the attacks. Outside the interview rooms, news of the arrest moved quickly. At a press conference the day after his capture, Wichita's police chief stepped onto a podium and announced that BTK was in custody. Residents who had been children in 1974, parents in 1985, and grandparents in 2005 heard the name Dennis Rader tied publicly to the murders that had shadowed their city for 3 decades. Shock spread through Park City's small government offices, where co-workers struggled to reconcile the compliance officer they knew with the accusations now attached to him. Parishioners at Christ Lutheran Church learned that their council president had been arrested as the long-sought killer. The investigation that had begun with 4 bodies in a small house on North Edgemoor had finally reached a living suspect. What remained was to translate the massive evidence and Rader's own words into formal charges and later into public accounting inside a Sedgwick County courtroom, a process that would expose the details of each murder to a wider audience than ever before. After the arrest on February the 25th, 2005, the criminal case against Dennis Rader moved quickly by the standards of a major serial murder investigation. Within days he was charged in Sedgwick County District Court with 10 counts of first-degree murder, one for each of the known victims killed between 1974 and 1991. The charges reflected the full series, 4 counts for the Otero family and 1 count each for Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wagirl and Dolores Davis. He made his first appearances in court in shackles, wearing an orange jail jumpsuit. The man who had chaired church council meetings and written code enforcement notices now stood behind bulletproof glass, flanked by deputies, speaking in a flat, controlled tone. At his arraignment, he entered a not guilty plea. That initial stance bought time for his public defenders to review the evidence. The DNA matched through his daughter's sample, the disc metadata, and the trophies and writings taken from his home, and his hours of recorded statements to detectives. Taken together, the material left almost no path to acquittal. Kansas law shaped the contours of what followed. The state had reinstated the death penalty in 1994, nearly a decade after Rader's last known murder. Under Kansas statutes, capital punishment could not be applied retroactively to crimes committed before the law's effective date. Rader's offences, all committed between 1974 and 1991, fell entirely outside its reach. Whatever the public might wish, a death sentence was not available. The maximum penalty was life imprisonment on each count, with the judge deciding whether those life terms would run at the same time or one after the other. Prosecutors prepared as if for a full trial, assembling timelines, forensic reports and witness lists. But the defense team understood that putting a jury through weeks of evidence would not change the outcome. Their focus narrowed to 2 questions: whether Rader would be found legally competent and whether there was any realistic way to mitigate the eventual sentence. To explore an insanity or diminished capacity defense, they retained a forensic psychologist, Dr. Robert Mendoza, to examine Rader and assess his mental state. Mendoza diagnosed narcissistic, obsessive-compulsive and antisocial personality disorders, conditions that explained aspects of Rader's need for control and lack of empathy, but did not meet the standard for legal insanity. On June the 27th of 2005, the case reached a decisive moment. The courtroom in Wichita was packed. Victims' relatives, reporters, local residents and law enforcement officers filled the benches and spilled into the overflow rooms. Rader, now 60, was led in and took his seat at the defense table. When the judge, District Judge Gregory Waller, called the case, Rader's attorneys announced that he wished to change his plea. He withdrew his earlier not guilty plea and entered a plea of guilty to all 10 counts of first-degree murder. In Kansas, a guilty plea in a major felony case does not end the hearing. The judge must establish a factual basis for each charge, meaning that the defendant has to describe what he did in enough detail to support the legal elements of the crime. Rader took a sip of water, adjusted his glasses, and began to speak. His tone was calm, almost lecture-like. For each count, Waller asked him to explain what had happened, where he went, what he did, and how the victim died. Rader obliged, moving chronologically through his murders. He started with the Otero family. He described parking near their house on Edgemoor, cutting the phone line, confronting the family at gunpoint, binding them, and then killing each one by strangulation or suffocation. He recounted how Joseph had fought against a plastic bag, how Julie was strangled on the bed, how 9-year-old Joey was suffocated, and how 11-year-old Josephine was hung in the basement. The language was clinical. He spoke of strangling, binding, and putting a bag over the head, answering the judge's questions as if clarifying procedural steps. For the murder of Catherine Bright, he told the court how he waited in her house, confronted her and her brother, shot Kevin, and then attacked Catherine when she resisted. He admitted stabbing her and attempting to strangle her, acknowledging that she died from the combined injuries. When Waller asked whether he understood that his acts were intentional and premeditated, Rader agreed. For Shirley Vian, he described luring her son to the door, forcing his way inside, locking the children in the bathroom, and strangling her on the bed with a ligature around a plastic bag. He moved through the remaining counts in the same measured style. Nancy Fox, breaking in, waiting in the dark, confronting her, allowing her to smoke, and then choking her with a belt until she died. Maureen Hedge, leaving a scout camp under the pretense of illness, hiding in her house and strangling her when she came home, then taking her body to his church to photograph it before dumping it by a rural road. Vicky Wagirl, posing as a telephone worker, fighting with her when she resisted, strangling her and taking photographs on her driver's license. And finally, Dolores Davis, leaving another scout camp, crossing fields to her house, smashing a sliding door with a concrete block, and strangling her with her pantyhose and hiding her body under a bridge. At several points, Judge Waller interrupted to press for clarity. When Rader used vague phrases like, "I proceeded to strangle her," the judge asked what he meant by proceeded and how exactly the victim died. Each time, Rader tightened his description. He had placed a ligature around the neck, pulled until there was no movement, and sometimes left the body posed. The judge also confirmed that Rader had not been coerced into pleading guilty, and that he understood no promises had been made about his sentence. Rader said he understood and that he was entering the plea because he was guilty. Outside the courtroom, the impact of that plea rippled through his family. In July 2005, his wife Paula filed for an emergency divorce, citing emotional stress. After 34 years of marriage, she obtained a decree that dissolved the relationship and awarded her the couple's property and his retirement benefits. She did not appear in the courtroom for the plea or for the sentencing that followed. Their 2 adult children stayed away as well, processing privately the realization that the man they knew as a father had confessed in open court to 10 murders. With the guilty plea in place, no jury trial was necessary. The case moved into sentencing phase scheduled for August. Under Kansas law, the judge would decide how to structure the 10 life sentences and would set the minimum term that had to be served before any possibility of parole. Prosecutors announced their intention to seek the harshest configuration available, consecutive terms that would, in effect, ensure Rader died in prison. The sentencing hearing opened on August 17th of 2005 in the same Sedgwick County courtroom. The atmosphere was different from the plea. Where the June proceeding had been dominated by Rader's voice, the August hearing centered on 2 other groups, the prosecution team and the families of the dead. Judge Waller allowed television cameras in the room, and footage from the hearing would later circulate widely, showing Rader seated at the defense table, his expression shifting between blankness and occasional tears as others spoke about his acts. Prosecutors began by laying out aggravating factors. They walked through each murder, emphasizing premeditation, the vulnerability of the victims, and the cruelty of the methods. Detectives testified about his preparation and his post-crime rituals. One investigator described how Rader had strengthened his hands with a squeeze ball after realizing they tired during strangulations, a detail that underscored how deliberate his approach had become. Another recounted Rader's own characterization of himself as a monster during interviews. Physical exhibits accompanied the testimony. Officers displayed a black mask used in one of the crimes, handcuffs that had restrained victims, and photographs seized from his hidden boxes. Images of Rader in women's underwear and masks, bound in poses that echoed the bondage of his victims. The images showed not only what he had done to others, but how he had rehearsed those acts on himself in private. The display reinforced the picture of a man whose inner life had been organized around capture, control, and strangulation for decades. The following day, the focus shifted to victim impact statements. One by one, relatives of the dead stepped to a podium and faced the man who had upended their lives decades earlier. Children of Julie and Joseph Otero, siblings of Nancy Fox, relatives of Shirley Vian, Maureen Hedge, and others spoke out about the immediate shock of the murders and the long arc of grief that followed. Some described nightmares and years of substance abuse or legal trouble. Others spoke of birthdays and holidays, permanently shadowed by empty chairs. Many addressed Rader directly, calling him by name. They told him how his acts had taken parents from children, children from parents, and siblings from one another. Some expressed rage and wished aloud that he could suffer the same fear he had imposed. Others focused on the loved ones they had lost, refusing to let his presence overpower their memories. There were pauses for tears, for composure to return, and then more statements. The hearing became a public record of the damage that extended far beyond the 10 lives he had ended. Rader sat through it, sometimes staring down, sometimes removing his glasses to wipe his eyes. When images of his staged self-portraits appeared on the screens in the courtroom, he looked away. At other times he listened attentively, hands folded, the same constrained demeanor he had shown in his plea hearing, now set against the raw emotion of the families. After the prosecution and the families finished, the defense had its turn. His attorneys did not attempt to excuse what he had done. They pointed instead to his age, his lack of prior criminal convictions on his record, and his cooperation after arrest. They noted he had accepted responsibility by pleading guilty, sparing the families a trial. They referenced the psychological evaluations diagnosing personality disorders, suggesting that his mental structure contributed to his crimes, though it did not absolve him. Their goal was modest, to argue against stacking every sentence consecutively in the most severe possible configuration. Finally, Judge Waller invited Rader to speak. He stood, turned slightly towards the gallery, and delivered a prepared statement that lasted several minutes. He apologized to the families, to law enforcement, to his own relatives, and to the community. He spoke of his faith, of asking God for forgiveness, and of hoping that, in his words, God would one day accept him. He described himself as a man who had done bad things, language that struck many listeners as at odds with the scale of his crimes. At points, his voice broke and he wiped away tears. Yet even in apology, the structure of his thinking showed through. He referenced his alter concept of Factor X, the internal force he blamed for his violent impulses, and spoke about his need for control. To the families, the words landed unevenly. Some later said they saw no real remorse, only a man preoccupied with how he was perceived. Others thought the apology mattered less than the fact that he would never leave prison. When Rader finished, he sat down, and the room turned back to the bench. Judge Waller spoke at length before imposing sentence. He described the murders as cold and calculated, emphasizing how Rader had invaded homes, toyed with victims, and left families to live with the aftermath for more than 30 years. The judge noted that each count represented a separate life taken, and that the law allowed him to recognize that reality by stacking sentences. Then he pronounced a formal sentence, 10 consecutive life terms. The structure of Kansas sentencing at the time meant that those terms translated into a minimum of 175 years before Rader would be eligible for parole. In practical terms, it was a lifelong confinement order. Prosecutors had argued for exactly that result, and the judge granted it, citing the extraordinary harm and the long period over which the crimes were committed. Deputies moved in as the hearing ended. Rader was led away to begin serving the sentence he had just received. Outside the courthouse, family members of the dead spoke to reporters. Some described a measure of relief, others stressed that no sentence could balance what had been lost. The court case was over, the legal outcome fixed. What remained would unfold in prison walls and the lives of those who had survived his crimes. A continuing story of custody, scrutiny, and the long shadow of a series of murders that had finally been given a name and a face. When the courtroom emptied in August 2005, Dennis Rader's world narrowed to a concrete cell and a daily routine under state control. Within days of sentencing, he was processed into the Kansas prison system and transferred to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Butler County, a maximum security institution east of Wichita. There he received a new identifier, KDOC Inmate 0083707, and a housing status that has never changed, isolation from the general population. He is held in what amounts to permanent protective segregation. The arrangement is officially for his safety. The notoriety of his crimes and the rage they still provoke would make him a target in open housing. He spends most of each day alone in a small cell. Meals, showers, limited recreation, medical checks, and occasional chaplain visits mark time. Contact with other prisoners is minimal. The man who once moved freely through neighborhoods, installing alarm systems and issuing code citations, now moves only under escort along short, controlled corridors. Even in confinement, the question of how much stimulation he should be allowed has sparked argument. In 2006, prison officials cited good behavior when they granted him privileges most long-term inmates eventually receive: a small television, access to radio, books, and basic art supplies. Prosecutors and some victims' relatives pushed back, warning that unfettered access to news stories and images of women and children would allow him to replay his crimes in his head and refine fantasies that once turned into action. A judge later recommended limits on the material he could possess, including restrictions on sexually explicit drawings or depictions of bondage. Administrators also faced choices about his communication with the outside world. Like other prisoners, Rader can write and receive letters, subject to screening. Over the years, he corresponded with a small group of people interested in his case, including criminology students, authors, and occasionally journalists, though the Department of Corrections has been pressured to curb anything that resembles a platform for self-mythologizing. Ethical debates that began while he was still at large about how much attention to give his letters and how closely media should cooperate with police continued in a new form inside the prison walls. As he aged, the question of how long he would remain under such tight scrutiny shifted from theory to biology. Now in his 80s, Rader's health has deteriorated. Reports from recent years describe heart issues, physical frailty, and signs of cognitive decline. Prison officials monitor him medically like any other aging inmate, but there's no realistic prospect of release. His 10 consecutive life terms require a minimum of 175 years before parole eligibility. The practical expectation shared by law enforcement and victims' families alike is that he will die in custody at El Dorado. Even with his life legally settled, his name continues to surface in active investigations. In 2023, the sheriff of Osage County, Oklahoma, announced that Rader was the prime suspect in at least 2 unsolved cases involving the 1976 disappearance of 16-year-old Cynthia Dawn Kinney, who vanished from a small-town laundromat. Investigators searched the grounds of Rader's former Park City home and released excerpts from a 1976 entry in which he discussed projects around laundromats. In 2024, an anonymous tipster sent authorities a copy of a crossword puzzle Rader had mailed to a Kansas outlet in 2004. When investigators studied the grid, they found an unsettling cluster of words: Cindy, Kinney, Osage, references to laundromats and Oklahoma place names that appeared to align with the details of Kinney's case. Combined with a journal of pages and rough timelines of his movements, the puzzle strengthened suspicions, but still fell short of proof. To date, prosecutors have not filed charges in any additional cases, though formal inquiries remain open and task forces continue to examine old files for patterns that match his known methods. Rader, for his part, has denied committing murders beyond the 10 for which he was convicted. The shock of his arrest and confession did not stop at the walls of El Dorado. Inside his family, particularly for his daughter Kerry, the aftermath has been long and public. She learned of his arrest in 2005 through a knock at her door, then discovered that the FBI had used her medical sample to build the DNA bridge that confirmed her father as BTK. Years later, she described the experience as a shattering of her sense of childhood, the camping trips, the church services, and ordinary evenings with a man who had spent other days stalking and killing. Kerry eventually chose to confront that history in a memoir, A Serial Killer's Daughter, published in 2019. In it, she described her father as the parent she had known, attentive in some moments, strict in others, and the disorienting process of matching that image with the man in court transcripts and evidence boxes. She has said that she forgave him in a religious sense, yet cannot reconcile her memories with his crimes. Living in Michigan with her husband and children, she has worked to build a life defined by her own choices, not by his name. Her relationship with him has remained strained and purposeful, rather than familial. She has written him letters and in 2023 visited him in prison for the first time in nearly 2 decades, not as a daughter seeking comfort, but as a civilian willing to help law enforcement probe possible additional crimes. Reviewing his journals as part of that cooperation, she came across entries that she found deeply disturbing. One referenced her by name, along with shorthand that he used elsewhere for bondage and games, leading her to suspect that she may have been abused as a child, something she had never previously believed. When she confronted him, he denied it and reacted angrily. After that visit, she announced publicly that she would not return. From the beginning, Kerry has used the visibility forced on her to advocate for victims' families and for the relatives of offenders who carry a different kind of stigma. She appears at events, gives interviews, and participates in documentaries with a focus on the damage done to families, not on elevating her father's notoriety. The Netflix series, My Father, the BTK Killer, released in 2025, centers her perspective and the unresolved tensions in their relationship rather than his voice. Beyond his immediate family, the people most deeply marked by Rader's crimes are those who lost relatives to him. For the Oteros, Brights, Foxes, Vianne's children, and the families of Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wergel, and Dolores Davis, the killings were not a history lesson or a case study. They were abrupt fractures in their own lives. Surviving Otero children have spoken about careers derailed, years lost to post-traumatic stress, and the difficulty of maintaining relationships in the shadow of that early horror. More than 50 years after the murders, some say they still cannot talk about the details with each other. The emotional weight is just too heavy. Charlie Otero, who was 15 when he found the bodies of his parents and 2 younger siblings, illustrates how those scars can evolve but not disappear. His life veered through rage, substance abuse, and criminal charges of his own before he reached a measure of stability. In recent years, he has lived and worked only a few miles from El Dorado, fully aware that the man who destroyed his family is held nearby. He has turned towards motorcycles and public speaking, talking openly about trauma and the choice not to seek violent revenge. He emphasizes that freedom, for him, means not repeating harm, even while the events of January 1974 remain too painful to discuss in detail with his surviving siblings. Other families have found quieter ways to carry the loss. Some rarely speak publicly, choosing private remembrance over interviews. Others participate occasionally in documentaries or anniversary pieces, pointing out that their loved ones are more than the manner of their deaths. Over decades, their statements have shifted some of the focus away from Rader's inner landscape and toward the lives interrupted. Parents who worked factory jobs and played music, women who held multiple jobs to support themselves, neighbors who kept to themselves and never suspected they were being watched. In Wichita and Park City, the case has become a permanent layer in local history. Streets and houses that once appeared on crime scene diagrams are still occupied. New families lived where the Oteros once lived, where Nancy Fox kept her duplex, where Maureen Hedge walked to her car. For many residents, those addresses are just that, places to live. For others, especially those who remember the 1970s and 1980s, the names still carry an echo of fear. Periodic media retrospectives, podcasts and lectures at regional universities revisit the investigation and keep the story near the surface, especially when new developments in cold case inquiries make national news. For law enforcement, the BTK case has turned into a training tool and a cautionary example. Homicide commanders and detectives who work the file have lectured in classrooms and police academies about long-term case management, offender communication, and the value of preserving evidence through shifts in technology. The decision to store biological samples from the 1970s allowed DNA profiling to be applied decades later. The care taken with the letters and envelopes made it possible to reassess handwriting, language patterns, and physical traces. The final break, tracing a deleted Word file on a floppy disk back to a church and a computer, has become a standard illustration in digital forensic courses of how metadata can outlast attempted deletion. Academics and clinicians have also used the case to examine personality structure and psychopathy. Rader's blend of rule following in public life and extreme sadism in private has been analysed as an example of how superficial normality can coexist with profound emotional detachment. Studies of serial homicide now routinely reference the long gaps between his known murders, examining how work, family obligations, and age might have shaped his cooling-off periods. Criminology texts discuss his tendency to speak about himself as an instrument of internal factor X, noting how that framing allowed him to distance his day-to-day identity from the acts he carried out. The media's role in the case has drawn its own kind of scrutiny. From the 1970s onward, local outlets served as an involuntary conduit for his attention-seeking letters, negotiating with police over what to publish and what to withhold. After his arrest, commentators and scholars revisited those decisions, asking whether coverage that centered the BTK name and his taunts contributed to his sense of status. That debate has sharpened in the streaming era, as each new documentary or dramatization raises questions about how to present his story without glamorizing him. Projects that foreground survivors and family members, rather than offering him fresh interviews, reflect one attempt to navigate that tension. Today, the practical legacy of the BTK case rests in three places. It lives in the continuing lives of those who lost parents, siblings, spouses, or children and have had to reassemble themselves in the decades since. It lives in the institutions that responded, police departments, forensic labs, prosecutorial offices, that adjusted practices after seeing how long a determined offender could remain undetected, and how small digital traces could finally close the gap. And it lives, unavoidably, in the culture that continues to revisit the story in the books, podcasts, and films, trying to understand how a man could lead such converging lives. Church council president, father and scout leader, code inspector, and simultaneously the planner of projects that ended in binding, strangulation, and abandoned bodies. In El Dorado, the physical story is simpler. An aging prisoner moves through the routines of confinement while investigators still test old puzzles and journal pages against unresolved disappearances. Outside those walls, families gather on anniversaries, tell and retell the stories of the people they lost, and decide how much space to give his name in their own lives. The case stands as a reminder that the most important story it carries is not about the man who coined an acronym, but about the 10 people whose futures he cut short and the long chain of consequences that followed. I'm DM Green, and if you followed this far, please remember to like, share, and subscribe. Until the next time, this is In the Dark Mind.